Yeah, after.
Yeah, we're recording.
Okay, everybody, everything you're saying is being recorded. I just wanted you to know.
No shows.
Okay.
Okay, we were fine.
All right. Morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Today we have the pleasure of talking about voting rights. And my name is Jim Federer. I am a member and a worship associate at this church, People's Unitarian Universalist. And as we all know, we have an important election again this June 7th, the primary, and in November, the general election. One very important question is, which political party will control the Senate and the House of Representatives, given that there are hundreds of voter restrictions that many state governments have added on their ballots? Also, will the Senate eventually pass the new John R. Lewis Advancement Voting Act that was already passed in the House of Representatives last August? These are just two of the reasons that I was excited a couple months ago about putting together a voting rights presentation. So consequently, I have 4 parts today for this presentation. Number 1 is the current voting situation in our country. Second, the history of how we reached this partisan voting situation. The third is the status of the 1965 Voting Rights Act and how it was seriously weakened. And fourth part of the presentation is, what should we ask ourselves to do at this time? Now, my intent in this presentation is not to make this a political discussion, but to keep political references as neutral as possible. But there are, however, various publicized state-by-state voter discrimination laws, and I will refer to some of them. I will not be addressing today the recent unusual laws mentioned in the April Cedar Rapids Gazette, an article that was proposed or even passed in at least 10 states in our country, including Iowa, in which election officials who count ballots, are all part of the counting and determining who wins process. They could see criminal charges and penalties against them that levy thousands of dollars in fines or even prison time for technical infractions of these election statutes. Now, what seems to drive this sort of craziness and all these other voter discrimination laws that have been enacted recently in many states, in most states actually, they still believe that Donald Trump was cheated out of the presidency, even though every state Secretary of State and or state auditor, whether Republican or Democrat, have certified that there was no voter fraud occurred and the 2020 election was fair. I expect to have time available for questions and comments particularly from you people right here in the church with me. And I will ask you whenever you think you have a question or comment that relates to the current topic we're talking about, just raise your hand and I'll stop, and as soon as I think appropriate, and let you know what ask your question or comment. There might be enough time at the end of the part 3 part that I mentioned, the 4 parts, 3 out of 4, for anybody at home who has a question or comments, and they can talk to our social justice chair, Marcia Swift, who is at the controls, and she will take your chat. Just use your chat when you're at home, and she'll read it and provide the question or comment in part 4. We have 1 hour until 10:45 to have this program. All right, now part 1, which I said was the current voting situation in our country. The insurrection against American democracy did not end on January 6, 2020, as we will know. Voting rights are still under attack, and there is a reason. It is under attack by a white nationalist movement, which includes white supremacists and hate groups that rejects the very idea of an inclusive society with fair and equitable elections. The impact of misleading propaganda and the growth of white power in our politics are bound together. The insurrection was perhaps the most disinformation-fueled event of modern history. Now, to change the subject a little bit, I believe that we at People's Church would vote no matter what our state and our governor do to make it more difficult to vote. However, recent anti-democracy laws in many states affecting our elections will be felt disproportionately by voters of color, especially Black voters who typically vote early and on weekends, who vote on Sundays when churches conduct souls to the polls, who require reasonable access to secure drop boxes, who require or who rely on food and water in order to withstand long voting lines, and who are more likely to cast provisional ballots. Those are the ones who will be more likely discriminated against. Now, here are just a few examples I want to bring up, and then after I name a few, if you have any out here, you like one of your favorite voter discriminations that you know about in maybe some other state too. Metropolitan Atlanta, an anti-voter bill reduced the number of ballot drop boxes from 94 to 23. In Texas, a GOP anti-voter bill could disenfranchise voters who speak English as a second language. In Arizona, a bill passed which limits the distribution of mail-in ballots and purges over 100,000 voters from the state's early voting list. Now in Iowa, as we may know, our Governor Kim Reynolds signed a legislation cutting the state's early voting period from 29 to 20 days. Plus now we need to ask for an absentee ballot request form starting May 18th. And I believe we only have until tomorrow at 5 o'clock to go down or call the auditor's office to request an absentee request form. Because no application forms for absentee ballot will be automatically mailed to us. Absentee ballots must arrive at the auditor's office by the time that polls close on Tuesday, June 7th, instead of arriving by noon the following Monday, as has been done before. Plus, closing the polls 1 hour later at 8 o'clock in the evening instead of 9 o'clock as in the past. Now, voting for this primary, I discovered is really easy. I went to the auditor's office on Friday and there was no waiting line. So he asked me how I'm registered. I said Democratic. So I got the ballot. And I should have been surprised, but there were like 20 different offices that I had to vote for. But only 2 had competition. There was 3 candidates for the United States Senate, and there were only 2 candidates for the State Secretary of State office. The other 18 only had 1 name. So voting was very simple. Now, has anybody else here voted already? Maybe any of you here?
No, not yet.
Maybe have you received a yellow card from the auditor's office as a reminder to come on down and vote at the auditor's office, or don't forget to vote on June 7th if you rather. In fact, this card told Jan and I that we have to go to a different voting place because of all this redistricting going on. So now we have to vote in Mount Mercy University Graduate Center on Matterhorn Drive Northeast. So make sure you know where to vote if you are going to wait until June 7th to do that. Now, because of these new stricter Iowa voting laws, an April 15th Gazette article which you may have seen in the Gazette here. It talks about this new voter coalition that is in Cedar Rapids. It has formed because they fear that these new state laws will make it too restrictive for some people to vote. So the goal, as it says in the article, one of the goals here is to help people with the 4 primary areas, to help people who are vulnerable, those who need help. They may be handicapped, maybe sick, or maybe just old, like some of us do get to be. Lots of vulnerable people who are going to say, no, I don't think I'll vote this time because they just don't have somebody patting them on the back and helping them. Well, this coalition is to help them to vote by registering people, informing voters about the issues, how to vote absentee or on election day, accountability to ensure politicians meet the promises they make on the campaign trail. This coalition will continue right until the general election in November. So people who still need help after the primary can still make contact with somebody who knows how to get, a hold of this group. And our main contact here at People's Church is Marcia Swift. She's over here. And her phone number is 319-721-7666.
Oh, thanks.
You could have stopped me right after the show.
No, it's okay.
Yeah, Marcia's a friend. So let's hope that all these organizations that are involved in this coalition, I only know about 7. And I think there might be 4 more now, but I don't know who they are. It's the Advocates for Social Justice. And by the way, the young lady there whose picture is on that article is Tamara Marcus. And I talked to her the other day, Friday. I talked to her. She was real pleasant. So she's associated with the Advocates for Social Justice. And if we need another phone number, she gave me, I have her phone number too, in case people want to call to get, find out how they can help people who need help to vote or register. So Social Advocates for Social Justice, the League of Women Voters of Lynn County is part of this coalition. Co-votes, the local chapters of the League of United Latin American Citizens, the NAACP, Indivisible Iowa, and the Sunrise Movement. Some of those you may be familiar with.
And now People's Church.
And now People's Church as well. All right. Well, as I mentioned before, all over the country, state governments are emboldened to enact discriminatory laws restricting voting, especially to discourage communities of color and people with disabilities. Now, that's especially true in Florida. Now, I want to concentrate on Florida just a little bit. The Civil Rights Report submitted to the Jacksonville, Florida City Council concluded that Jacksonville's districts show a consistent pattern of racially polarized voting over 14 elections since 2013. 14 times that you could detect polarized voting. The whites were kind of counteracting every black vote, is the way it was presented. And coincidentally, 2013 was also the year the US Supreme Court initially weakened the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And I will talk about that some more in part 3. Now, some state lawmakers, like in Florida, are drawing partisan legislative maps called gerrymandering to choose which voters they want in each district map. Then what appears to be an effort to rally the Trump Republican base, the right-wing Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, he released his own version of gerrymandering in April, recently, which is even more gerrymandered than the extreme GOP House in Florida have provided. Some said it would cut the number of black districts in Florida in half. Well, fortunately, there's a judge down there. He said that Republican Ron DeSantis, who drew up this constitution, or he drew up this gerrymandered map, and the judge says that is unconstitutional because it breaks up a district where Black voters can choose their representatives. This judge, Leon County Circuit Judge Lane Smith, said he would issue a formal order to keep the maps that this governor has done, to keep the maps from taking effect in November's election. That's good. The challenge focuses on a North Florida district now held by Democratic U.S. Representative Al Lawson. The district runs from Jacksonville west more than 200 miles to Gadsden County, and nearly half of its population is Black. The judge recognizes that this gerrymandered map is unlawful and diminishes African Americans' ability to elect representatives of their choice. DeSantis is wrong for enacting this Republican-leaning map that is in clear violation of U.S. and state constitutions. So that's the good news. And you wonder how many other states are going to challenge or go to court to litigate against some of these voter discrimination acts before the November election. Maybe they will. It's hard to keep track of all that, but that's part of the process of all of us to keep watching that. Because Biden beat Trump fair and square, but Trump claimed the election was stolen without evidence, the GOP as a whole believe they have to use gerrymandering and manipulate the Electoral College in order to gain back the presidency, plus more state offices as well. Now, that's the question. Will we continue? Will the Democrats and others challenge these? Well, here's some other good news that might help with these challenges. There are organizations in our country like the Southern Poverty Law Center, SPLC for short. They are taking up voting rights and various other racial justice litigation cases against states and against numerous hate groups and against anti-government groups. These three type groups spread their myths and disinformation. Plus, of course, they spread fear tactics, which encourages more of the same type of voter discrimination. Last year, the SPLC documented 1,221 active hate and anti-government extremist groups across the country. They have been identifying these groups since at least 1999. 733 of this 1,221 total are hate groups of about 12 different types. 2 hate groups and 3 anti-government groups are in Iowa, defined by the SPLC as within or west of Des Moines. So there doesn't seem to be any right around eastern Iowa for some reason. It's okay. We'll discuss these groups again in part 2. The extremist ideas that mobilize them now operate more openly in the mainstream, political mainstream. Now, who here is familiar with the SPLC? Good, like every hand went up except one. They define themselves, the Southern Poverty Law Center defines themselves as a catalyst for racial justice in the South and beyond, but the South seems to be the main effort. Working in partnership with communities to dismantle white supremacy, strengthen intersectional movements, and advance the human rights of all people. They also litigate cases involving education discrimination in schools. They fight for the rights of refugees, in cases for adoption rights, for LGBTQ rights, and likely will be fighting states for abortion rights as well, the way things are looking. I think we should remember that racial justice includes fighting for fair voting rights and all these other rights as well. Unlike other countries, we as individuals work together as groups, have the freedom to fight for our rights. And it takes a fight to do it. Okay, part two, the history of how we reached this partisan situation we're in today. Let's go back to post-Civil War. 3 years after the Civil War, on July 9th, 1868, the 14th Amendment to the US Constitution was ratified, extending liberties and rights granted by the Bill of Rights, plus full citizenship rights, including voting rights, to all men born or naturalized in the United States. So for the first 80 years of our country, only white males could vote, but now some black males were enfranchised. Everybody remember those days? I guess we don't. We weren't here then. But in early 1870, about a year and a half after this, the 15th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified and provided full citizen rights, including that voting rights were not denied on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. This, of course, included African-American males, most of whom were former slaves. However, following the Civil War and continuing into at least the 1980s, Blacks and other minorities were continually being hurt and killed and discriminated against by white hate groups, such as the Ku Klux Klan, for example. Finally, after a long struggle, the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920, after World War I ended in 1918, provided full voting rights to women. Women had to wait 50 years later than the black males. Various hate groups have been part of our country for a long time. There were white anarchists, there were even white anarchist anti-government hate groups in 1918 and 19, demonstrating at that time against Catholics and immigrants. Our government retaliated against this at that time and went so far as to pass in 1917 and 1918 the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act, which made it very unfavorable to be a radical or to be an immigrant, showing almost any disrespect against our government. Prison penalties were not unusual. But finally, Democratic President Lyndon Johnson from Texas had the power and the influence to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and followed that up with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That resulted in the Southern Democratic Party states rebelling against these acts and turning into Republican states, just as they are today, and helping to elect Richard Nixon as president in 1968 and 1972. Again, at that time, there was the rise of white nationalism and various hate groups. However, there was also the start of an organization I mentioned before that formed in 1971 as a clear-headed legal advocate for the vulnerable who were otherwise disadvantaged to protect their rights, and that was Southern Poverty Law Center. It is still very active and located in Montgomery, Alabama. And Jan and I, on our way to Florida this January, we stopped in there and walked outside of the building. We couldn't get in. There was a guard outside, but they had this beautiful water fountain, and all the way around the fountain was engraved was the dates of so many civil rights acts and marches and things. So it was quite impressive. It's right on Washington Street if you ever get to Montgomery, Alabama. Now, the Southern Poverty Law Center helped defeat the Ku Klux Klan in a Supreme Court landmark case called Donald versus United Klans of America. In 1981, the SPLC attorneys filed a civil suit on behalf of Donald's mother, and Donald was brutally murdered by the Ku Klux Klan. Finally, 6 years later, in 1987, they won an historic $7 million Supreme Court case, a verdict that significantly reduced the influence of the United Klans. However, what has helped to get the current SPLC identified hate groups more organized and more publicized was the 2017 Unite the Right rally in Charlotte, North Carolina, during Trump's first year in office. Trump was there at the rally, as you may remember, and was sympathetic to their cause. In 2018, 1,020 hate groups were identified. Last year, in 2021, there were 733. So there were 287 fewer hate groups than 3 years earlier. Now is the time I like to show a chart that's inside of this booklet that I got from the Southern Poverty Law Center. I'm on their mailing list because I have donated to them. But here's a map of all the states. I hope you can see it. And it has white dots and red dots. And every state has some. The red dots stand for the anti-government groups, and the white dots are the hate groups. And what I'll do is just read off some of the hate groups, okay? See if they sound familiar. Ku Klux Klan, still active. Neo-Nazi, white nationalist, that's the biggest one of all. 98 white nationalist hate groups. Racist skinhead, Christian identity, neo-Volkish, neo-Confederate, anti-immigrant, anti-LGBTQ, anti-Muslim, anti-Semitism. Say it for me.
Semitism.
There you go, anti-Semitism. And the biggest one are just general hate groups. Now I can tell you what that means. General hate groups are defined right here. No, that's not the one I want. Okay. The general hate groups, of which there's one in Des Moines, they defy simple categorization. They embrace a broad range of bigotries, including misogyny, anti-Semitism, and anti-Black, anti-immigrant, and anti-Muslim views. All right. Now, on page 61, there are 266 anti-government general type of groups. There's, like I mentioned, there's only 5. Did I tell you that there's only 5 different types of anti-government groups? The big one is the anti-government general. Apparently one in Pleasant Hill, Iowa, and another 2 somewhere in Iowa, out west, I think. Anti-government groups are part of an anti-democratic hard right movement. They believe the federal government is tyrannical, and they traffic in conspiracy theories about an illegitimate government of leftist elites seeking a new world order. So it's the kind of things that places like Southern Poverty Law Center and others are fighting. Any comments on any of this? Any questions? Joe?
Here in Iowa, what percent of the population falls into this negative category? Got any idea about that?
No. Yeah, I don't have any idea of how many people, what percent of the population would fall into these groups of hate groups or anti-government groups. No.
You think it'd be as high as 10%?
Oh, I don't know. I hope not. I would hope not. Yeah. Well, you know, as we get into part 4, I can give you information on how to look up the Southern Poverty Law Center's website, get more familiar with them. Now, all of this hyper-partisan politics that's still going on now and the long-running COVID pandemic we've had have combined to produce a wide cavalcade of misinformation, ignorance, conspiracy theories, self-defeating protests, and more voter restrictions. Okay. We still have plenty of time. Part 3 is, what is the status of the 1965 Voting Rights Act? As we know, the act does not now prevent gerrymandering and other recent voter restrictions due to 2 Supreme Court decisions that weakened the bill. The first in 2013 and the second in 2021, just last year. The first decision in 2013 gutted the law in Shelby County, Alabama versus Holder, involving federal government voter coverage formulas and pre-clearance requirements. Now I'll get into that a little bit more. This decision by the US Supreme Court to remove these federal requirements opened up gerrymandering as we see it abused today. The second decision in July of 2021 involved Brenovich, the Attorney General of Arizona, versus the Democratic National Committee, where certain procedures used by Arizona voters were challenged by the state, and the Supreme Court backed up the state. This opened the door for more voter restrictions that we have witnessed in 2021 and this year too. Does anybody want to hear more details about those 2 cases? I can give you more detail. Oh, you got it. One person raise their hand and I'll do it. Nobody wants to know more. No, it's an interesting story. John Roberts, our current Chief Justice, was involved in both of those. And
How did he vote?
he voted 5, they voted 5-4. He was part of the majority opinion,
Okay,
mainly conservatives versus liberals.
in both cases, he was part of the majority?
Yeah.
Okay.
The other case, it was 6-3,
Mm,
and the second one in Arizona.
mm,
So, yeah, I mean, the government has been using formulas since 1965 to watch over what states are doing, like Alabama, for example. What are they doing to avoid voting discrimination and sharing, fair voter registration and all that? So the government was an oversight, but suddenly the Supreme Court says, "Oh, no, that's old stuff. We've been doing that for 40 years. Let's stop that." And now it turns out now we're all vulnerable again because
mhm.
we don't have a Supreme Court. We don't have this law backing us up. And that's why there's this new law, the one I'll talk about in a minute. John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act, which is stuck right now in the Senate. Joe, you had your hand up again?
Yes, now this may be off the agenda for you here at this program, but would we all be better off to work at getting rid of the electoral college? Getting rid of because the electoral college is not in the Constitution.
Mhm.
And the idea of the electoral college is a major problem. That's how Trump got into office. That's how the majority of the population is usurped.
Mhm.
So instead of constantly reacting to all of this reactionaryism,
Mhm.
wouldn't we be better off to try to create some positive movement?
Yeah, I will talk about that a little later.
Okay.
However, it seems like you're right, because this is the same thing happening with abortion rights. It's not in the Constitution either. And so the Supreme Court says, well, yeah, we can change this. Voting rights, we can change it. We can make it tougher. So I think lots of things could be changed. And unfortunately, they often just cause more chaos. But maybe not the electoral college. Maybe that's an example where we eliminate chaos. Think it through. All right. Well, soon after that second Supreme Court ruling last year, the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, otherwise known as the VRA Act, it passed in the US House of Representatives. Nancy Pelosi gets everything passed pretty quick. And that was passed in the House on August 24th of just last year, not even a year ago. This bill would restore much needed protection and revitalize the Voting Rights Act of 1965. All Democrats in the House voted in favor of the legislation, and all Republicans voted against by a vote of 219 to 212. Note that the House rules limit the 60-vote filibuster rules, and therefore voting in the House is just based on a simple majority. The Senate initially tried to invoke cloture on this bill, which is a procedure that limits debate to 30 hours of debate in order to avoid the existing filibuster type rule that requires 60 votes to stop debate on a bill. Well, even that cloture event or experiment attempt didn't work, didn't happen. Consequently, the bill still remains before the Senate and faces an uncertain future due to the filibuster rule. And that's another thing, Joe, that maybe could be changed. We'll talk about that too in a little bit. This new John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act addresses voter registration and voting access, election integrity and security, redistricting, and campaign finance. It expands voter registration, that is automatic and same-day registration, plus voting access, you vote by mail or vote early voting. It addresses all of that. So the question remains, if and when this bill will be taken up, and could it happen before the November election? What do you think about that?
Not a chance. Not, was Mitch McConnell's there.
Not a chance, particularly if we don't get more Democrats in the Senate than we have. That would be nice if we had a couple more Democrats in there and maybe convince Joe and Kristen to change their flavors.
Not like
I don't know. Maybe something will happen that might help them. All right. Again, change does not happen unless enough voters demand it. So how do we demand it? Well, I think we're ready for any questions that may have come in from Zoom.
No, not so far. If you have questions on Zoom, please type them into the chat.
Okay. Well, now I'm in part 4. Unless somebody wants to talk some more about what I've talked about. We do have now a good 15 minutes yet.
Let me can I throw out an idea?
Mm-hmm.
Our current economy over the last 40, 50 years has created about 6 or 7 super states: California, Texas, Florida, New York, Illinois, Georgia, and then it's left all these other states to be gerrymandered, if you want. And we don't want to admit that we have a national economy as we have, or it doesn't seem to come into view. And all of this impacts what the discussion you're putting on the floor. And so the question becomes, how do we, the people, get back in charge of the government? And one of them is to get rid of the electoral college. There are some other things that need to be discussed, which I didn't prepare a list for, but I just want to throw that out where these states like California, Texas, and Florida have gained so much impact on the House and on the Senate, if you want.
Yeah, well, okay.
Do I have a question? I'm not sure I have a question, but Citizens United that allowed corporations to buy, I'm going to say it that way, to make contributions to people who are being elected. how would we change that other than an amendment again that would again come up against the Senate and its Citizens United elected people.
Yeah,
Instead of corporations being recognized as persons or individuals, it should only be living beings,
Mhm.
Yeah,
humans who are allowed to contribute, not corporations.
yeah, and the big money is evidently all of the money that we might make a contribution to a person probably doesn't add up to what one corporation can just take and hammer.
Right,
particularly at the federal level.
Yeah.
But local levels,
Well,
Maybe.
my thinking, my readings tell me that the major change, one of the major changes that's happening currently is to take over by various groups of little people, school boards, local governmental groups like small towns in Iowa, taken over by people who speak loudly and have followers.
because they had more money to.
Because they had more money, or they have ideas that seem to, well, for instance,
Mhm.
everybody's blaming gasoline price on something or other,
Mhm.
when the other reality is, we don't understand the fact that, for instance, baby food, or these specialized foods that are required by people who have severe health issues because they are allergic to almost everything.
Mhm.
So they have to have baby food. So now there's only, then we come now to find out that only 4 corporations in the world are producing the majority of the materials needed for that.
Mhm.
And, it's just like Hershey's. People don't understand that just a very few companies own, for instance, like General Foods, or some of the Swiss companies that.
How does this do with voting?
Well, I mean, they're controlling the votes. And how do we counter that?
Okay,
That's the basic question.
yeah. Well, certainly, we need good balance of judges and in the Supreme Court, better balance. We need more Democrats elected, I would say. But let me go through this a little bit, get into the electoral college question a little, and because we'll get some more thoughts here. Do we want to know more about these racist groups? If you do, you should really, and maybe now is the time for that chart, Marcia. We need to know, that the Southern Poverty Law Center has a lot of insight too on what is going on with these hate groups. They're litigating against white supremacist people and so on, things that are important to us, the things that we mentioned. There's lots of civil rights and racial rights that are not being met. But if you are interested in the Southern Poverty Law Center some more, there is their website there. Is that right, Marcia? That's there? Okay.
yep, it's on the screen here.
Take a look.
Yeah, on the screen. It's nothing but SPLCENTER.org. And it has an exceptional rating, 4 stars out of 4 by what I call one of the top charity rating services that we have, called Charity Navigator. How many have heard of Charity Navigator? Oh, okay. CharityNavigator.org website, and I've used that recently. You can put in any nonprofit you want. The Southern Poverty Law Center is a nonprofit, 501c3. So you can donate to it so they can continue their work. You can get their website, give them some money and you'll get these catalogs like I have. And you'll, learn more too that way. So that's a good way. Now, we have that website, okay? So some of you others are familiar with it. Another important nonprofit that fights back against state-by-state attacks on people's rights, such as voting rights, access to abortion, transgender justice, classroom censorship, immigration rights, and freedom of speech, is the American Civil Liberties Union. Now that one has different nonprofit groups in different states. And when I went on charitynavigator.org, it would say, well, most of the states, it was a good charity, but some aren't quite as good as others. So that's one too, that we ought to spend more time looking at it and see how we could help them. If you want a Southern Poverty Law Center phone number, I have that as well. Maybe I shouldn't give it out right here, but let me know. That's one way to get to talk to somebody. And once in a while, they've even called me and they wanted me to get involved in calling this Confederate veterans group that meets in Stone Mountain, Tennessee, I believe it is.
Georgia.
Huh? Georgia. Okay, Stone Mountain, Georgia. I should call them and tell them to quit having their meetings.
Yeah, right.
But because it's a gathering place for white supremacists up there. Or you can I have an email too that I could, share with anybody about sending that to that Confederate group in Stone Mountain. Or we still have another group called the Common Cause. Common Cause Joe, have you heard of that one?
Oh, yeah.
It's a nonpartisan lobbying organization that wants to eliminate the Electoral College.
Okay, can I intercede for about 30 seconds?
Sure.
Governor Reynolds has kept the legislature open, trying to force a Republican group to hand out money to to take public education money and give it back to individuals who want to teach at home or support this redneck set of ideas. And the legislature, the budget, the Iowa legislature still has not passed a budget this year because Reynolds is acting in behalf of some of these redneck groups that you're talking about right here in the state of Iowa. So you don't need to get out to Alabama or Georgia. We need to figure out, how to talk to people in Buchanan County or Delaware County or, right here at home. Because our state is so upside down because the way the corporations have arranged the population. Anyway, that's a whole other subject, but everything you're talking about is right here.
Yeah, well, Iowa's a red state, so it all
And
applies.
it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be red.
Well,
one of the issues interesting is how the laws now have been changed to allow public education money to be given as a grant to somebody who wants to send their child to a private school.
Yeah,
And private schools can be a religious school that discriminates.
yeah.
That's exactly what it's saying.
You think that would be in the courts somehow? Why isn't it?
Should be a law.
Well, it will be.
It will
Yeah,
be.
it will be. Yeah. Huh?
In the meantime, yeah. It will be.
Maybe it is. We don't know what's going on, all in process.
Well, they have to pass it first. before
Right.
they Go to court.
Right.
Yeah, well,
So they can't
okay.
be talking about it.
It's not passed yet.
Right. But she's having closed door meetings to
Yeah.
convince
Yeah,
public superintendents to. Yeah, what happened to the sunlight law? Yeah.
yeah. Well, Common Cause would be one too that receives the most, they want whoever gets the most popular votes, combining all 50 states in the District of Columbia should be the winner for the president.
A Common Cause is going to be our third quarter for Sunday collection recipient.
Oh, really? Oh, okay.
In my opinion, the electoral college negates one person, one vote share. Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, it was set up as discriminatory,
Right.
thinking
Right.
that we don't have the smarts to be able to vote, only the wealthy and landowners can decide who's gonna be our president, so it was discriminatory from the beginning.
Yeah, we just have to get our votes out. I mean, this local coalition here should be, yeah, if you talk to anybody who's hesitant about voting, you know, call Marcia or see if that person would be willing to work with this coalition.
Don't we have a social justice, email address?
Oh, PC, social justice @gmail.com.
There you go.
All right.
Thank you.
There's one more thing I have to get in, and that is there's this other voting system that's being talked about. And again, it's gaining attention right here in Cedar Rapids. It's called the ranked choice voting. All right, and it's been talked about for years. But now apparently there's a committee in Cedar Rapids that is, every 10 years they can talk about, maybe we ought to change and vote differently. And they are recommending to go to a ranked choice voting. Now, right now it's intended only mainly for local elections where there are 3 or more candidates for an office. And it's meant to simplify voting, promote fair and nonpartisan elections, and offer an alternative solution to low turnout, more expensive runoff elections. And it can work very simply. You know, if you have 3 people or 4 people running, and you look at who gets the most votes and nobody has a majority, you say, well, the one who got the least first place votes or the most votes for the election, for the office, we eliminate that person. But look at the ones who voted for that person, who did they vote for second place, for third place? And then you add that back in. And then you see how things look. And then you might remove the third place voter, you know, the one who's now in third place, and look at who voted, what that person voted for in the second choice. It kind of weights that person who had a lot of backing, but maybe didn't get enough of the first place votes to begin with. But there's a lot of backing for that person.
But you know, in order to use that system,
Yeah.
the state legislator
Has to.
pass. And so the emphasis has to be on getting the state to make a change,
Right.
you know, which is
Yeah.
back to square one again.
Well, they should allow it for communities like Cedar Rapids to use it if they want to.
Sure.
Sure.
But, you know, places like Minneapolis and St. Paul have been using that ranked choice voting for years. And now Alaska uses it, Maine is using it. So it's functional and it's been used. So the question becomes how to get the Iowa legislature to move into the modern age.
Yeah, right.
Show them money.
Now, in the last minute I had, if Clark Mickey was here.
He's on Zoom.
He is?
Mhm.
Okay. I'm surprised he didn't put in a question, but if he
Well,
was here,
he
he would want to talk about the Alaska voting method. Because it's a little bit different than it's part of ranked choice voting, but it actually puts in Republicans and Democrats into the same category where you would vote to pick one or the other. It wouldn't be just one party.
Really?
So Clark, maybe someday will put together a forum and maybe present it here or somewhere else.
Mhm.
But I think he would be, he could explain more about that one too, Joe.
Yep.
Yeah.
Clark has worked on this for, he
Yeah.
lived in Minneapolis, so he
Yeah,
practiced it, you know, previously,
right.
you know.
So now we're at the end of the 45 minute, 1 hour. We're at 11:45. It's time to break up. But above all, always remember that change does not happen unless we demand it. And we can send messages to these people, our candidates, the ones who are in office, the ones who are not yet in office, and tell them we are demanding that this happen because it's best for the country. They just need to be convinced that more people are interested. And on that chart that I had, there are a few phone numbers there, like for our two senators.
I went off of it. You want me to put
Oh,
it
okay.
back on?
I have the phone number there for Joe Manchin,
And
and also I could give you the one for Kristen Cinema.
I know, when I've tried to call the offices of US senators from other states, they don't take my call.
Yeah. Our own senators don't take their call.
They won't take text, they won't take a text.
They do not respond to invitations to come to league forums. They do not respond to invitations to come to meetings. They do not respond for my question to attend their meetings. They're in their own little world right now. And
Right.
I want to say something about, voting issues in Lynn County and Cedar Rapids. The last time I did an absentee ballot, we can only have one absentee ballot box per county. Right? Okay, so we live in a city, we can drive 10 minutes away. All right, I drove to the ballot box and it used to be you could drive up and drop it in. Well, now the law says it has to be monitored 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, Sundays included, which costs us money.
Right.
Okay, so I go to drop my ballot in, I have to park in the lot and I have to walk to the ballot box. All right, if I was older than I am, not capable, if I had children in the car, this makes it extremely difficult for people to vote.
Right.
And I talked to Joel Miller about that, and he got really mad at me because all he did was spout the law. And I said, but the law doesn't tell you where it has to be changed. Why did it have to be moved from the spot it was where I could drop it in? And he didn't want to talk to me about it. But that is, and if you live in a county where you live, you talked about counties being 200 miles in Florida. How the hell are you supposed to go to the one box?
One box.
To vote
Well,
200 miles away?
in Georgia, I think they have, in Atlanta, they
Well,
have.
I know, but what I'm saying is, if you live in a small community in Iowa
Yeah.
and you have to drive and you don't have access to a car or somebody to drive you, that is voter suppression. And the other thing is, your neighbor can't take your ballot to the ballot box. Your neighbor would get fined, and your ballot becomes inactive. I mean, those are laws we're dealing with in Iowa. People need to know about those things.
Yeah, I don't know if you can get approval for somebody to
No,
take.
it has to be a relative.
Okay, a relative.
Well, what if my relatives live in London
Yeah.
and Colorado and Chicago?
It'd just be good to know what the exceptions are,
Yeah, well, okay, are you gonna risk having your ballot be in as your name, you're gonna risk going to jail? I mean, it's a felony to do.
Yeah, right.
It's a felony.
We need to know exactly.
To do a good deed for your neighbor.
That's Iowa state law.
Yeah, that's the law. If that's our legislature, we pass this stuff. And, we try to let people know, but I think so many people still do not understand how difficult it is to go in our state.
In every state.
Well, it's a felony to take that out.
Talk about 200 miles probably out of Wyoming County. Yeah,
Well,
it's like that long.
Well, my daughter lives in West Iowa. Yeah, I know.
All right, Zoom people, I think we're ending now. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's chaos here.